We're still in the beginning of the Mishnah, the opening of Pirkei Avos. Moshe killed Torah Sinai, Masor Yoshua. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai and he transmitted it to Yoshua. And we explained, I said something very interesting. I mentioned there was a story, Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, introduced an analytical approach to Torah, which in every yeshiva in the world, since his time, all the greatest Torah sages utilize his analytical approach. I'll give you an example. If you study Rambam, this is his main work was Yad Chazaka. He codified the oral law into 14 sections. That's Yad. Yud Dalid. Yud is 10. Dalid is 4. Yad Chazaka. It took him 25 years to write this codification. And Rambam in his introduction writes that if you study what he had written, this is a total encompassment of Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law. The whole total oral law is contained within these 14 sections, which he had authored. So if one studies that, you've studied the total oral law of the Torah itself. Initially, it was misunderstood what he had written. People had thought Rambam saying, Maimonides saying, you no longer have to study Talmud, Gemara. Just study what he had written. As a result of that, in his time, there was a tremendous protest because they didn't understand what he meant. And what they did was they went and they burnt the books of Rambam because they felt this is like a heretical statement. He wants to try to uproot the Torah. And it was led by Rabbi Yonah of Grundy, who was in Paris. And then he realized that he made a mistake, made a very bad mistake. He's the one who led the group for the sake of God and burned the works of the Rambam. When he realized he made a mistake, you know what he authored? He authored the work Shari Tshuva, the gates of penitence, or repentance. And he went in that work, that is a fundamental work of how to do tshuva. He was doing tshuva, repenting for this very extreme, serious mistake that he had made. But because they had done that, last Friday, there was an unofficial fast. Why? Because a number of years later in Paris, the king decreed, based on with the church, that the Talmud is antithetical to Christianity, and they go and they deprecate it. Therefore, they gathered all the scrolls, and this is before the printing press, all the handwritten scrolls of the Talmud, and they burnt it in the same location that they burnt Rambam's work. They burnt 14 wagons loads of the Talmud. Could you imagine? Know what this was? You know how long it takes to write just one set of Talmud? It takes years. And you have to authenticate it. It has to be proofread. Because even one mistake could be devastating. It's supposed to say permitted, it says something else, or it's not quoted correctly. It had to be examined and checked. Endlessly, 14 wagon loads they burnt. This was a punishment for because they had disgraced the Rambam publicly. Last Friday is the date that they burned those wagon loads of the Talmud, 14 wagon loads of manuscripts of the Talmud. Rabbeinu Tam, who headed the yeshiva of the Tosfos, this Ashkenazic position of Torah. He was a grandson of Rashi. He was known as Rabbeinu Tam because the Torah refers to Yaakov Avinu as Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Olim. He's that perfect person who dwelt in the tent, and his name was Rabbeinu Yaakov. He was the grandson of Rashi. And he said it's the appropriate thing is that on that date that they burned the wagon loads, we should fast. It was such a tragic event. Okay, that's the story. In Rabbeinu Tam's yeshiva of the Tosfos, every one of his students was proficient in the whole Talmud, committed to memory. However, every one of his 60 students had as his expertise in one tractate. So he had every student who was the expert in that particular tractate to rewrite that tractate. Now, God forbid, if they wouldn't have had these people as proficient, as precise and meticulous in rewriting it, it would have been the end of Judaism. Because without the oral law, the written law has no value. This is the story of the burning of the wagon loads because they had burnt the Rambam. Okay? Fast forward a few years ago, Notre Dame had a fire. Right? Famous fire with Notre Dame. It was burnt down into embers. You know where they burnt those wagon loads of Talmud? Where Notre Dame stands. There's a day of reckoning. Fast forward, going 800 years later, God takes his pound of flesh. Notre Dame burns to the ground. And the location which they burned the wagon loads of the Talmud. So it's interesting. Because they disgraced the Rambam burning his works, 14 wagon loads of Talmud were burnt. And because they disgraced God's name publicly with the intent to uproot Judaism, God says, you know something? The second shoe hasn't fallen yet, but it will fall someday. And that's when Notre Dame was burnt to the ground. So the Chavetz Chaim writes, King Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. You don't think he could have come up and invent the telephone or the automobile? I mean, his level of genius transcends anything human. Based on the verse, the Talmud tells us, the Midrash tells us, that his intellect was, if you take all the wise people of the whole Jewish people and put them one side of the scale, Solomon's wisdom, he outweighs the whole nation combined. I mean, it's not to be fathomed. His wisdom touched on the divine. So why did he invent the telephone, the tape recorder, the camera, or any modern technology? Why did he do it? He had no interest. Why? So the Chavetz Chaim writes, very interesting. As generations distance us from Sinai, the generations become diluted and weakened, and we have more difficulty coming upon certain truths. For instance, the verse says, that God knows every nuance of what's going on the terrestrial level. So people ask questions. God is in heaven. And we're having a conversation there. Does God really know what my conversation is? At one time, nobody would ask that question because that level of belief in God was, of course, God is everything. But as time goes on, it becomes a little blurry. So what does Hashem do? You create the telephone, invention of the telephone. So you're able to draw what we call a kal v'chomer. If one is in one location and you speak to another person in another location, and one person is able to hear the other location, although he's not there. So if a human can hear what a human says, God in heaven, you don't think he's able to hear what's being said? So it's only to give us an eye-opener in terms of understanding what God's capacity is, what his capability is. On the day of reckoning, they're going to present the person's life. Every movement, every nuance of your behavior is going to be shown to you. Is it possible? Person lives 70 years and literally countless events. Every event, every movement, positive, negative, is going to go onto that board. Like they used to have in the post office. All the wanted men were on the post office. FBI had the wanted people there. God's going to have those photographs. How? We invent the camera. Still photos. So if we could have a still photo, which we evidence at a trial to convict a person, I mean, God himself can't produce an image of what happened when the person transgressed or committed the crime. Of course he could. We go further. We're going further down the hill. Sometimes you need to hear exactly what the conversation was. The photo doesn't exactly give us a clear understanding. What was it? Malice? Was it accidental? Was it manslaughter? Was it deliberate? Who knows what it is? We have to understand the nature of the conversation. Know what we do? No question. We invent the tape recorder. You're able to tape a conversation. You can tape a conversation even beyond the person's life. You hear a person speaking, he has been alive for 50 years. It's like he's still talking to you. Again, so as the generations weaken, new technology comes out to compensate for we're not there any longer, to give us an understanding of what God is. Okay? At one time, the Talmud was committed to memory. People had a different intellectual capacity. Everything was committed to memory. And it's not they necessarily had photographic memories. The level of diligence, review, and everything, having that in the forefront of your mind, that allowed them to retain it precisely. And it had to do with their understanding of who God was, what their responsibility was. But as generations continue to decline, it's no longer the same thing. We're not as dedicated. We have distractions. The world is a different world. What does God do? No problem. Invent the printing press. And no longer, you don't have to have those select few who are able to be scribes who record it. You could print 1,000 sets of Talmud. I used to say, in Rosh Yeshiva told me when he studied in Slobodka was a suburb of Kovna, what they call today Kiwanis. The yeshiva had one set of Talmud. And when you borrowed a volume, you had to leave a deposit. They had one set of Rambam. And my Rosh Yeshiva had a photographic memory, and anybody who wanted to know what the Rambam said in a certain volume, that a number of students, you would go to him, and he'd quote the Rambam verbatim with all the commentary on the page. Because they'd have that many books. You have 200 students, and you have one set. I mean, how many people could use the same book? So there was a waiting list, and you had to leave a deposit, so on and so forth. So what does God do? No problem. Printing press, but at one time printing, you had to have a line of type. Wasn't simple. To put out print a book was a fortune. So it's not easy. All of a sudden you have photo offset, whole different type of printing. You don't have to set type any longer, and this and that. Today they could print thousands of sets of Talmud. You have a library edition, you have a pocket edition, and you have a table edition. A bar mitzvah boy today, he gets gifts. He could be the greatest Torah sage in the world. He has the library edition. And when he travels, he could have a pocket edition. And when he goes to school, he takes his table edition. You understand? And one time they didn't have books to go around for 200 students. Today, you could drown in it, and people, they don't know from one page to another what it says on the next page. You understand? That's the way we're holding today. But again, God brings these new innovations, new technologies to facilitate and to accommodate us, that we should be able to maintain ourselves and not totally go below the water. We should be able to tread water minimally. This allows us to get into treading water. We don't have memories, retention. All of a sudden, you have a computer. You have a chip. You could have 1 million pieces of information on the chip. Every responsa, you go into a computer, you can download 1,000 responsa. You have some of the rabbis today. They know almost nothing. They have to say a lecture. They download it. You think they talk about one of the leading Torah sages of the generation, because they downloaded whatever the subject matter is and every opinion, and even they heard a recording on it, how to say it, and it's not even the question of plagiarism, because it's obvious it's not theirs, so it's not plagiarism. You never think for a moment it's theirs. Okay, I'm being a little facetious on this one. Okay, but it's a reality. But initially, it was all oral transmission. Moshe Kibbutz told me Sinai, Masorah to Yeshua, transmitted to Yeshua, Yeshua to the elders, and so on and so forth. When they received the transmission, it had to be redacted, transferred identically as it originally was heard from God. It's more than a photographic memory. It's more than you have that attentive memory, much more. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Laws rules that when you buy a pair of tefillin, you should buy a pair of tefillin from a scribe who's a Yorei Shamayim. He has fear of God. Why? Because when you have the finished pair of tefillin, you think it's kosher, and you examine it. But when you write tefillin, it has to meet certain criteria. And if you don't meet the criteria when you write it, although the end product looks perfect, it may not be kosher. And there are times where the scribe has to start writing over again. It costs him endless hours and endless money. And sometimes he succumbs to his financial needs, to his frustrations, and he may give a pair of tefillin that's not kosher. And the buyer will never know it's not kosher. Only God knows it's not kosher. So therefore, the Code of Law says when you have a scribe, you purchase tefillin or a mezuzah from a scribe or a Sefer Torah, you should make sure he's a Yorei Shamayim. He's a person who truly fears God. If he's not God-fearing, you can't rely on him. He can be honest, but a person somehow justifies certain things, and therefore you can't rely on him. He has to be above reproach. That's the quality of the person. You understand? So it's not you have a photographic memory. It's not you're knowledgeable. You have a level of honesty and objectivity. Under no circumstance will you compromise that level of honesty. That's the type of person he has to be. So the original transmitters of Torah, if they had an ego, and the ego somehow will put a little different slant on it, it may be a nuance, that person is not qualified to be one of the transmitters. He's not sufficiently responsible. You know, in the government, I don't know about today, but at one time, he worked in certain areas. You had a background check. They checked you out from today forever, from your childhood, your friends, your circle, where you travel, everything about your life they knew. Otherwise, if you didn't make the grade, you would not enlist. They would not take you. If you wanted, it's no fact, the United States is lax on this, but you want to join the Mossad in Israel, which is the equivalent of the CIA, need more than that. They do such a thorough check. And if they see, I'm not even talking about the capability of the person. That's understood, he has to be capable. But in terms of, they do such a security check, and if you don't meet it to the nth degree, they don't accept you into the Mossad. Because they value their existence to such a degree that if there's any level of compromise on that, you're putting the whole state of Israel in jeopardy. All Jews are in jeopardy. So when you feel the responsibility of what you're assuming, then even if you have the capacity, you're vigilant and you review and you trust nothing unless you actually put it through endless tests to make sure it is what it's supposed to be. That's a reality. The original transmitters of Torah, it's not only they had genius minds, they had retentive memories, and they had quality character. They had a level of fear of God to the degree we can't even relate to what it meant, what they feared God. Their reverence for God, not to a fear of punishment. Reverence, a total negation, you negated to God. That was a basic prerequisite to be qualified, even to be considered to be a transmitter of Torah. Because if there's any degree, nuance of compromise, and it's not perfect, you're putting Judaism in jeopardy. It's no longer Judaism. It's the Talmud tells us, if we will classify the early generations as angels, then we could be classified as human beings. And if you classify the early generations as human beings, then we have to be classified as a bunch of donkeys. And even who were classified as donkeys were not even at the level of the donkey of Pinchas ben Yoyer. Pinchas ben Yoyer was the father of Reb Shimon Yochai, the author of the Zohar. What's the story about the donkey of Pinchas ben Yoyer? Pinchas ben Yoyer, two thieves, they stole his donkey. And it was in Israel. The law is that if you the produce, the grain of Israel, any produce that grows there, you're not permitted to eat of it unless it's first tithed. This obligation is only on a human being. Pinchas ben Yoer's donkey, because it was his possession, was so holy. So the thieves, they have his donkey, they want to feed it. The animal's not eating the feed. They feel they got a dud over here. His donkey, if he doesn't eat, he's worthless. They're not going to bother. So what do? They went and they abandoned it and they went and stole another donkey. The donkey came back to its owner, to Pinchas ben Yoyer. Understand? So that's what it says. If you classify the early generations as human, we should have to be classified as donkeys. And we're not even at the level of the donkey Pinchas ben Yoyer that he had such a sensitivity to spirituality that he wouldn't eat grain if it wasn't tithed. What does that mean? If we have a recognition, understanding, they're the equivalent of angels. They have a capacity we can't even fathom that dimension of person at any level. The fear of God, the love of God, the capacity of their understanding at every level, breadth, depth. If you understand that, then you could be classified as an intelligent human being. But if you see them as human and we're all within the same classification, they know a little more. No, the rabbi knows more than I know. Yeah, but you realize I'm a Wall Street guy. I retired at 40 years old and I was wearing red sneakers, cat sneakers that I bought out of a used shoe shop. You understand? You know what you believe? You belong in the zoo. If you think that. Because if you think you're within the same realm, that maybe you understand better than the rabbi. But if these rabbis are classified as angels, they're not even part of your realm of existence. So there's not even a question. You totally submit to whatever they say. That's the understanding. So these people we're talking about over here are beyond, and they made these evaluations. And they were recognized as that by their own peers. They were the elite of the elite of the elite. So even their peers or the commoner had an understanding that he did not have an understanding who these people were. I'll give you an example. I was a pretty good student when I studied in yeshiva. Every day I would walk with my Rosh Yeshiva very often. I could take a walk with him for an hour and a half. And when I walked with him, understand, we didn't speak about the sports. We didn't speak about current events. He had the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud on his fingertips. And he could quote from anywhere. When you saw what he knew, as much as I thought I knew I couldn't hold up a candle to him as a student. And he had a level of genius that even if I'm a smart guy, he was able to come up with things he thought at another level of understanding. When you understand that, then you're humbled. And when you're humbled, then you understand how much work there is to even come close to what he is. But if you think we're basically the same, he knows a little more than I, so you don't get excited about who he is. But if you have firsthand understanding who he is, but you can only have that sense of who he is, you have to have some relevance to what he represents. Otherwise, he's just a rabbi who has a long black coat with a Hamburg and whatever, and he holds a Hebrew book or Aramaic book in front of him.